before I start. bit of a problem. I've been asked to give a State of the Nation speech to include some coverage of Brexit, and I don't intend to write my speech until next Monday. So it's a bit difficult to know what to say. Following on the football theme, a game of two halves. I'm just going to say a few words about the context of the world economy and what's driving the UK government and therefore what drives local government. In other words, what would the issues be that we were addressing today if Brexit were not happening? But then obviously cover Brexit, and does Brexit impose a fresh set of issues on us, or does it compound the issues that would be there anyway? The world economy grew by 5% last year. But that 5% is the middle of the developed world, economies like Britain growing by 2.5%, while the developing world, countries like China and India, grew by 7.5%. And so clearly, the focus of the world economy is moving towards those developing nations, while some of the older economies have slower rates of growth. And we would have to deal with that. Either way, there will be, whatever happens, China will be the biggest economy in the world within the next decade. Within 2 decades, India may be the second largest economy in the world, with America in number 3. How does Britain find its way in that global economy, where the focus may be in Asia Pacific more than Europe, or as much as in Europe or North America? Second big issue to deal with is obviously the lack of trust and confidence in public institutions. I personally think this is the biggest thing I've seen in my professional career. The public don't trust business, they don't trust government, they don't trust public institutions. For this purpose, you're all members of the elite. You know, you're all in, if you don't mind me saying so. And as the elite, we are self-serving. We just care about ourselves. We have nice homes. Our children do well, we're comfortable, we have good holidays, and business and society is designed to protect and to help us, in their view, and we couldn't give a flying fig about people whose wages haven't gone up in real terms for 20 years. And that sense of anger, whether it's in the Rust Belt of the US or whether it's in large swathes of ex-industrial UK, clearly runs very deep. Now, I would argue very strongly that remains long after Brexit. So I think that suddenly everyone's going to trust the government because we've left the EU. You know, taxi drivers will say to me, well, I never used to trust the government gov, but now we've left the EU, I think it's, I really trust everybody. Isn't society doing well? That deep sense of mistrust will not go away, and at the moment we don't necessarily have a strategy to easily address that. Now, I don't know how we'll look back on this period. When we look back in 30 years' time, there are times where it's quite straightforward, isn't it? We look back on the 60s and it's the permissive, the swinging 60s where society liberated. We look back on the 30s and it was clearly an age of depression and recession. Sometimes people live through a period and they don't know what it is. The period before the First World War was clearly the end of an epoch, and the First World War fundamentally ended deference and a society with lots of servants, and that people didn't know at the time that they were in that Edwardian sunset of the age of empire. I don't know what this period will be regarded. Will it be looked back on the time where trust and confidence first reared its head and wasn't addressed? Will it be the time that AI, the full implications of it to society were not quite understood and harnessed? I just don't know. And my take on life at the moment, and I'm going to come to this now, is we're not going to know for quite a while. And that brings me just to the UK. There are some fundamental issues for the UK that aren't easily addressed. Productivity, why does it take a German worker 3 days that it takes a French worker 4 days, but a UK worker 5 days to produce the same item. Why is our productivity quite poor? And what's happening in the way that we equip people to have skills for the future, that we're falling behind a little bit in terms of productivity. Productivity is the key means of addressing trust and confidence, because for the economists in the audience, productivity equates to wage growth. And where there are no improvements in productivity in an economy, there can be no improvements in wage growth. The problem is, whilst productivity generates wage growth, it generates change that frightens people. If productivity means we don't need drivers anymore, or productivity means that we can automate a significant number of jobs, whilst in the medium term it generates the wage growth that society feels so strongly that it needs, it also scares people about their existing roles and their existing jobs. For the UK, there's an additional issue to deal with, that for the last 20 years, we're what I refer to as a 37% tax economy. All governments of any political colour tax at about 37% of GDP, whether it was Blair or Brown or Cameron. And because governments, they might change the tax within that a little bit more income tax, bit less corporation tax, or vice versa. The 37% state, in about 15 years' time, will only be able to afford old age pension benefits and the NHS. So we can all see that a 37% state is essentially squeezing out the rest, because we have to pay for an ageing population and we have to pay for an NHS. The rest of the state is going to get crowded out unless we can find massive productivity gains and/or unless we pay more tax. And again, these bigger issues: how do we improve our productivity? How do we balance that with the need to create trust and confidence in our institutions? What's the long-term fiscal prospect for how much tax we have to pay with an ageing population? None of these issues are in a way Brexit related, and because we're in the midst of it, we can't necessarily see the age that we're in, just like Edwardian Britain before the First World War. Now, Brexit. Going well, isn't it? So my take on it is this. I've already mentioned that I can see an argument why Britain wants to peg itself to the global economy, as it's the developing world economies that may grow. But of course, no economy trades mainly other than with its near neighbours. And so whilst we could argue that we're leaving the security of strong trading arrangements with the EU in order to one day trade in a more global world, of course we are taking the biggest gamble in our economic history, because all countries mainly trade with their near neighbours. At the moment, we have more trade with the Republic of Ireland than we have with China and India combined. It's an amazing statistic, but it's true. So we're taking a huge gamble. Now, the one thing that you can say about Britain is that we have firm and decisive government compared to many systems. The UK Prime Minister is often referred to as an elected dictator. And if you go back in the midst of time, the King used to go to Parliament and ask for supply. Can I have some money? And in the end, Parliament said, well, you can only have that money if you operate through Parliament, and your First Minister, the King's First Minister, the Prime Minister, operates through Parliament. And so we have a very, very strong Prime Minister, where in effect, compared to many other systems, the Prime Minister also operates many of the powers of a head of state. Our monarch has virtually no powers. The Queen reigns, she does not rule, and many of the powers of a head of state, from appointing bishops or appointing the new Auditor General, are exercised through the Crown prerogative by the Prime Minister. And so What Brexit will expose for us at the moment is a constitutional crisis because the Prime Minister is unable to govern. The government is unable to govern effectively. And Speaker Bercow last week, in allowing procedural motions to the House to be generated from the back benches rather than only from the government, it arguably changed the Constitution last week. And it's a funny thing, and I'm sorry if this is a complicated point, but in the old days we were a bit more like the US. Parliament used to be at war with the government until we decided that we'd change that and the monarch would operate through Parliament. And of course the American Constitution was based on how Britain was a few hundred years ago. The House of Representatives and the Speaker is the old House of Commons from about 1700. The Senate is the House of Lords. The President is the monarch. And they didn't want the tyranny of King George anymore, ruling without power, and so they created separation of powers to temper the power of the king. Now, what we actually find for the first time at the moment is we're almost having 300-year-old politics where the House of Commons is beginning to rear its head against the executive, and the executive not necessarily ruling. And that's the American system, but we haven't really operated that way for a few hundred years. I think that you all can see, we can all see, that the Prime Minister is in an imponderable position. The only way of getting Brexit through the House of Commons and avoiding a second referendum, in numbers terms, would appear to be to go for a softer Brexit. That could garner more support from the Labour Party, but that would divide her own party and create civil war within the Conservative Party. If she moves to the right and goes for a harder Brexit in order to keep her party united, some of her own party would fragment, probably a smaller section of the arch Remainers. There are fewer arch Remainers than arch Brexiteers. But while she may then be able to keep her party together, she won't be able to get it through the House of Commons, because on the whole, the House of Commons is both against a hard Brexit and against no Brexit. I think it's impossible to gauge what will happen in that context. I suppose if I were putting my money on it, I'd just make a very short-term prediction that extending Article 50 in order that we have longer to negotiate will rip the government apart. I can't see how extending Article 50 will happen without significant disruption within the governing party, because that would be ruling out a no-deal Brexit at this stage. And as we can see, there are 117 MPs who are against her. So we are probably heading for a period of renegotiation and no certainty about what the outcome will be. And the outcome could be a harder Brexit, it could be a softer Brexit, it could be a referendum and no Brexit at all. And I think it's impossible to predict. What I'll come back to, if I may, is the government is not going to sort out in that context those sticky issues that we have to address. How do we improve productivity? How do we create trust and confidence? How do we deal with some of the issues that we've failed at? The UK is so admired around the world. We have incredible soft power. People look for our experience and our expertise. There are many things that we are viewed as doing really well in the soft power index every year. Britain comes top. I always gauge this by what percentage of the Game of Thrones cast is British. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, my God, we have tremendous power and influence. If I think about little old CIPFA, we're an accountancy body. But half of our students are now overseas. Our single biggest client is the United Nations. Our last examinations for accountants were taken in 80 countries. That means that we now have online examinations rather than people sitting in drafty halls. We have real-time online proctoring of the examination rather than asking somebody to stand at the front in that hall. So we've fundamentally changed our business in order to improve our productivity and operate globally. Otherwise, we would have gone down. But the fact that people want to buy our qualification and train with CIPFA around the world is because of the strong branding of the UK. And I think, obviously, what we all worry about is the British will muddle through. You know, we will get through Brexit. And in many ways, I would argue still that we're in a better position than the US, because the fundamental divide in America that you see, where it isn't a debate about which policies do we want, it's a sort of culture war, a values-driven culture war, where one side hates the other. Although we're having a bit of a flavour of that, we're not quite as bad. But also, we don't have the American Constitution, which is incapable of resolving that because of its separation of powers, and, you know, shutdowns and other things won't happen in our system. So however bad things are here, we will get through it. I fear that Brexit will damage the economy for a while, and it will take quite a transition for us to get through. But I guess my advice is, don't look for government to sort out your problems, folks. Local institutions, local authorities, housing associations, you're going to have to sort out your issues of productivity, partnering, how you work. Probably the biggest policy failure of the last 30 years is that we haven't built enough houses. That's going to be solved locally by people in this room. And it can't be like the life of Brian, where we know we've all got to be individuals, but we say to government, tell us how to be individuals. We have got to find our own way and our own confidence in working that through. And I do believe that we'll do that. But Brexit now creates this fundamental problem that we're used to having a strong government, and for a period of time we're not going to have one. I was on holiday once in Cyprus to finish, and the tour guide was telling us the difference between the nationalities that she took around these ancient Greek temples. And she said it's very interesting. She said the Germans want to understand where every building was and how high it was and why that building was situated next to that building. She said the French, on the other hand, less interested in the buildings, very interested in nature, the flowers, the plants, the site itself, its ecology. She said, my Arab tourists tend to be very wealthy. They're very interested in when they can go shopping and what they can do. And I said, well, tell me about the British. And I'm desperate to know, what's our national characteristic? And she said, well, and she put on an accent at this point, she said, the British don't really care so long as they can have a nice cup of tea. Thank you very much.